I want to talk about Tengen. And if you don't know what that is, I'm sure you've at least seen the original Nintendo cartridges that were black with the gold trim. They looked and felt illegal to own because, well... But in order to talk about Tengen, I have to talk about Nintendo. And in order to talk about Nintendo, I have to go back and talk about Atari. In the early 1980s, video games and arcades were everywhere. And Atari was one of the biggest names in that entire market. They found success in arcades, they found success in home consoles. The first really successful home console in existence was the Atari. And while Atari was doing a lot to push the medium forward, there wasn't a lot of quality control. And it wasn't exactly Atari's fault. This was a new medium. It was hard to get anything nailed down completely. But this lack of quality control led to a lot of bad games or broken games or unfinished games being released to the market. And at the same time that was happening, arcades are starting to shut down and shutter their doors because the fad is dying out. Those two factors, and probably more, are what led to the video game crash of 1983. And Atari, as a brand, was video games. So understandably, they took a huge hit. Now in 1983, Nintendo was hard at work creating their first home console. And their name also being synonymous with video games, they didn't quite know what to do either. Investors were shying away from them, retailers weren't sure about their purchase agreements, and they weren't even sure if consumers were going to buy this thing. So Nintendo had to do something to appease everybody, which is why they created the Seal of Quality. And you've probably seen the Seal of Quality to this day on Nintendo products all across the entire industry. Now for investors, retailers, and consumers, that seal meant a promise of quality control. But for developers and publishers, that just meant a lot more hoops to jump through. In order to release a game for the NES, you had to be a Nintendo licensee, which of course meant you had to adhere to a whole bunch of quality standards, and it also meant that Nintendo had final approval of any game that you created. But it also meant that Nintendo got a cut of every game that was created for the console because of their lockout chip technology. As a Nintendo licensee, you got access to the official Nintendo cartridges. These cartridges contained the 10NES chip, which communicated to the console that this was official licensed software. These cartridges also cost about $10 to $15 per cartridge, and that's 1980s money, by the way. And publishers couldn't buy the amount of cartridges they wanted. They had to buy them several thousand at a time. Now, arguably, the Nintendo Seal of Quality is what saved the video game industry from complete devastation. But Nintendo having at least some creative control and also getting a cut of the profits did not sit well with developers and publishers. Which brings us back to Atari. By 1984, the Atari Corporation was basically two different entities. There was Atari Games, which was basically responsible for their entire arcade division, and then there was a newly created subsidiary that was responsible for all the home console games, which Atari had named Tengen. Now at this time, Atari and Nintendo were pretty friendly with each other, which means that Tengen quickly became a Nintendo licensee. And Tengen just started porting their arcade games to the console. Everything seemed to be working out fine. It was a cordial relationship. Executives from Nintendo met with executives from Tengen. They had dinner, they had lunch, they went golfing, they discussed business. But Tengen, and by extension Atari, couldn't let go of the fact that Nintendo was still scraping off some of their profits. Some of those cordial lunches and golf outings seemed to be Tengen trying to get a little bit more information about that lockout chip. But Nintendo said nothing. They insisted that all licensees were treated exactly the same. There was no preferential treatment for anybody. Except for Tengen wasn't done trying. Tengen created an entire team to try to figure out how to circumvent the lockout chip, and nothing was working. They tried everything to reverse engineer the chip, but they couldn't figure out a way to crack the code. And it wasn't long before they realized the only way that they were going to get this is if they got the schematics of the chip themselves. And since Nintendo wasn't budging on the issue, they went to the next best place. The patent office. Now, of course, Nintendo had patented their lockout chip technology. Of course that was a thing. Now, when Tengen reached out to the patent office to get the schematic, they were told it was proprietary information. But at the time, there was a loophole that you could get that proprietary information if you were part of a legal battle. So Tengen told the patent office that they were in a legal struggle with Nintendo over some copyright issue, and that they needed the lockout chip schematic to make their case. And the patent office said, okay. Tengen's team reverse engineered the chip, and then they started working on the cartridges themselves. They skipped the classic gray design of the cartridge in favor of a more Atari look, which was the black plastic. And they even included their own little seal of quality. Tengen started bargaining with retailers, they started taking out ads in magazines. They were practically convinced that this was the beginning of the end for the Nintendo licensee program. In reality, it was the exact opposite. Tengen and Atari were immediately hit with lawsuits, because of course they were. And while the legal battles continued for years, Tengen lost pretty much all of them. And in 1994, about 10 years after Atari formed the subsidiary, Tengen closed its doors for good. So now you know why those little black cartridges exist. And while Tengen did release some licensed games on the NES, people still believe that the Tengen cartridges are the best way to play those arcade games on the Nintendo Entertainment System.